This is another in our series of interesting people in Montana. Hello there. I'm Ed Craney of the Greater Montana Foundation. As this historical film is being processed, it's October 15th of 1963. 58 years ago today, a young man with a straw hat on his head stepped off of a train from Salt Lake at the depot in Butte, Montana, into a snowstorm. That young man is sitting beside me tonight and is going to tell us something of the early political history of the state of Montana. Ladies and gentlemen, Senator Wheeler.
Thank you.
Senator, that was 1905.
That's right.
And you've written a book fairly recently called Yankee from the West. I have a copy of it here.
Yes.
Which indicates that you're not from the West.
That's right.
You came here from Massachusetts.
Came here originally from Massachusetts, yes.
And how did you happen to land in Butte?
Well, after I got out of law school in the University of Michigan, I had decided to go west, and I traveled all through the West looking for jobs. I went to Colorado first, and then I went to Oregon, I went to California, then I came back into Arizona, New Mexico, and then finally back to Colorado, and then finally went to Salt Lake, and then finally came up to Montana looking for a job, and I couldn't find anybody that was anxious to employ me.
In other words, young lawyers then, as young lawyers now, have a tough time getting started. Is that it?
They have a tough time getting started. I think they have a tougher time then than they do now. Maybe I'm wrong about that.
I see. Well, after you came here, you landed a job.
Well, what happened is I went around to all the law offices in Butte.
Yes.
I even went to the Anaconda Company's office and asked them for a job. But they didn't give me a job, and finally the only man that offered me a job was John A. Shelton. He offered me $50 a month. But I inquired about him, and they told me that he was tough to get along with and one of the meanest men in town to get along with, and so I decided to leave Butte. And I got down to the old Northern Pacific Depot with my grip with all my belongings in it, and a couple of men stepped up to me and asked me if the train was always late. I said I didn't know it was late. Well, finally they said, well, how about having a drink? And I said, I don't drink. Well, they said, how about having a cigar? Well, I said, I'll take a cigar. Well, to make a long story short, they sat down came to a little saloon that's still down on the corner of Nevada Avenue and Front Street. And they sat down at a table and they said, how about having a game of cards? Well, I said, I'll play pitch with you. High, low, jack, a pitch. Oh, they said, no, play poker. And I said, I don't play poker. But they got me into the game, wiggled me into the game, and they took my money away from me.
So you were broke and had to stay in Butte?
So I was broke, and I came up and I saw John A. Shelton, had dinner, and said, John A. Shelton, and I said, I've decided to stay and take the job. He said, where you staying? And I said, I'm not stopping any place. Well, he was an old bachelor, lived over on Broadway, and he said, well, come on, bunk here until you get straightened out. So I went to him, worked for him for $50 a month, had a little difficulty getting my money. And finally I opened an office with a young man by the name of Klaus, who after a short time went to Alaska, and I had one desk and two chairs and the Montana Code.
Well, now, Senator, as I remember reading your book, there was a young lady in the book during college days when you were out putting yourself through school selling cookbooks, wasn't it?
That's right. I was selling old Dr. Chase's receipt book with a medical student.
And this young lady resided back in Illinois, and I suppose that after you made enough money to get back there again, why, then you decided to get married and bring her out here. Was that it?
That's right. I tried to sell her mother a book and couldn't sell her one, but I
sold the young lady a bill of goods, huh?
It was about lunchtime, and she asked me to stay to lunch, and then after that I stayed to lunch and met the young lady, and after that I courted her, and after I got out here and made a few dollars, I went back and...
And what year was that, Senator?
1907.
1907. And how long did you practice law before you started in getting interested in politics here in Montana?
Well, I wasn't interested in politics. When I married, came out here after my wedding back east, I met the assistant clerk of the court. He said, I want to congratulate you, and I said, I've got a nice little wife. He said, I'm not congratulating you on your wife. He said, Matt Canning's going to offer you a partnership. And I said, well, I didn't know anything about it. And he said, well, he is. And so Matt Canning sent for me and offered me a partnership. And I said, on what basis? And he said, 50-50 basis. He said, I want you to look after the law and I'll look after the politics. I said, I want no part in politics. I don't want to have anything to do with it. But about a year or so later, the boss of the 7th Ward where I lived was in little trouble, and he went to Canning and wanted me to help him out. I said I didn't want to do it. I didn't even know whether I was a Democrat or Republican in those days. And, well, he said he's a client of ours, a good friend, and you go down and help him out. So I went down and went to the convention. And after I went to a few conventions, why, then I became interested in it and been in politics ever since.
Well, what was the political situation here in Montana back in 1905 and 7? And what year was it that you did get interested in it? 1909 was it?
No,
8 or 9?
No, I went to the city convention, and then I was nominated at a city convention for state for city chairman. I didn't
of the party.
Of the party.
I see.
I didn't even know I was going to be nominated, or wasn't interested, wasn't seeking it. Con Kelly got up, and who was then chief counsel for the Anaconda Company, and nominated Phil Gillis. And somebody else got up and nominated somebody else, and then Patty Duffy, who was president of the miners' union, got up and nominated me, and somebody came over and said, my goodness, you're not going to let your name go up. And I said, I didn't have anything to do with it, and I didn't know it. And he said, well, you ought to withdraw. Oh, I said, I'm not. But by a fluke, I was elected.
You were elected.
Yeah. And after that, I went to the county conventions in 1908. In the city conventions in those days, the county conventions, the only people that would be nominated would be an Irishman, and from top down to bottom. But after they'd nominated the sheriff and county attorney and everybody else, then the company was interested in the legislature. So Harry Galway, who was one of the company people and a very charming person, he'd get up and make a motion that they appoint a committee to pick out the legislature. And he'd say, now listen, you can't have all Irish on the ticket. You've got to have some Protestants on the ticket, and you can't do it because it'll hurt the ticket. So they'd appoint a committee. And I remember distinctly there was a fellow called Guineen Sullivan who lived up in the Gulch, and he would open a bar during election and get a case of whiskey and a keg of beer, and you went up there and he'd lay down $20 gold piece, and they'd ring it up. But he got up and he said, Mr. Chairman, he said, I move you that there isn't a damn man from County Cork on that committee. And the real fights that used to be in the convention was whether you came from County Cork in Ireland or whether you came from the rest of Ireland. And the company then, in 1908, they met down at a wholesale liquor store on Broadway, and they would pick out the legislatures. So they sent for me in 1908 and asked me if I wanted to go to the legislature, and I said no, I didn't want to go. 1910, again, they sent for me and asked me if I would want to go to the legislature, and I said I thought I would. So I went to the legislature. I wasn't unfriendly to the company at all, but I got over to the legislature and I started voting for Walsh. And they were opposed to Walsh. That's where the fight started against me.
Walsh was for what office?
The United States Senate.
He was for the Senate. That was the days when the legislature appointed the
legislature did.
The senator.
That's right. And they were against Walsh because they said in those days he was a radical. He was looked upon as a radical.
I see.
As a matter of fact, Walsh is a conservative, and if he'd have been appointed on the Supreme Court by Roosevelt, he'd have made Hughes look like a liberal when it come to the Constitution of the United States. But in those days, if you wanted to run for dog catcher in Butte, you had to go up to what we called the 6th floor of the Hennessy building and with your hat in your hand say, please, can I run for dog catcher?
But you didn't have to do it that way.
I didn't have to do it that way, and I always resented it. But after I voted for Walsh in the legislature, then someone came to me and said, you can't go back to Butte. And I said, well, if I have to leave, I'll leave with more money than I had because I had nothing when I came here. They sent people down to my precinct in my ward and said anybody can go at the convention excepting Wheeler. Walsh was defeated that time, and Henry L. Myers, who was their man, was elected. I wouldn't have voted for Myers because I didn't know him. Johnny Maroney, who was then the boss of the Anaconda Company's political organization and the head of the Daily Bank, sent for me and wanted to know what the trouble was. I said to Mr. Maroney, I don't know. I don't know whether you think I'm a thief or a damn fool, and I don't think I'm either one. Well, he said, we can't get together on Walsh, and who can we get together with? I named W.B. George of Billings and state senator, and I named Hartman, and I named Colonel Nolan. And he said I would walk barefooted from Butte to Helena for Colonel Nolan. But he said, I don't think I can elect him because some of my people don't like him. So we left, and he gave me the first 25-cent cigar that I ever had on that occasion. But afterwards, they elected Henry L. Myers, and he said to me, listen, I could elect Tom Carter tomorrow. Tom Carter was a Republican senator. He said, I could elect Tom Carter tomorrow. But, he said, Carter doesn't want it, and my boss, John D. Ryan, doesn't want it because he said he doesn't want any scandal. The Lorimer scandals had just been disclosed in the legislature, and he said they don't want any scandals about it. Because he said, but I can get enough Democratic votes over there to put Tom Carter across, and I said, well, I know you can. But then they elected Henry L. Myers. And I only voted for Myers, and I first went to Walsh and asked about him, and Walsh said he was all right. Well, of course, he was one of the most subservient people that they had in Congress.
And then later on, Walsh went to the Senate.
2 years later. 2 years later.
And you were still in the legislature then?
No. I never went. They never let me go back to the legislature.
I see.
No, but 2 years we passed in that legislature, 1910. We passed a law saying not a real direct primary, but a law that was somewhat that the legislature was in honor bound to elect the man that got the biggest number of votes, either on the Democrat. Well, Walsh ran and got the biggest number of votes, and the legislature elected him at that time.
Before that, it hadn't been that way.
Before that, it had not been that way.
I see. Well, now, after Walsh was in, you were appointed...
After Walsh was elected, I was at St. James Hospital, and I'd had trouble with my ear, and he came down to the hospital to see me and said he wanted to have me appointed United States District Attorney. And then he did. He appointed me in 1913.
Well, now, Senator, let me ask you, how did you enjoy that kind of work as district attorney?
I enjoyed it tremendously. It was a great experience for me. I had never had any experience as a prosecuting attorney, and I had never had any experience in the United States before the federal court.
You'd always been on the defense before that.
I'd always been on the defense and trying cases.
And being a United States District Attorney for Montana took you out all over the state, I imagine.
Took me all over the state, and when I first went in there, I made up my mind that I was going to be a good trial lawyer when I came out. And I went in and I tried little cases of all kinds and character, and I handled the cases before the grand jury because I wanted to find out how evidence affected the ordinary layman's mind. And in a grand jury, when you presented evidence to the grand jury, you could see how the various evidence affected the average layman's mind.
Well, you made a great study of it because your reputation as a trial lawyer has certainly lasted a great many years.
Well, when I came out of there, After was a successful trial lawyer, and I was sent for all over the state to help other lawyers.
Senator, while you were United States District Attorney for Montana, we were in World War I.
That's right.
And then World War I came to a close, and we made the world safe for democracy, and we come up to 1920.
But before that, when I was United States District Attorney, and the hysteria swept over during that war.
Yes.
Hysteria swept over the West, and everybody who had a German name or a foreign name was suspected of being pro-German. And every labor organization which asked for higher wages, they were accused of being pro-German, and every farm organization was. And if anybody had told me that the American people would have so completely lost their sense of balance, I wouldn't have believed it. But that's what happened. And then, because I wouldn't prosecute every labor leader that asked for higher wages, or every farm leader, or everybody that had a German name, unless they produced evidence to me, then they accused me of being pro-German, notwithstanding the fact that I'd been pro-Ally. But, however...
Well, I've heard you labeled in World War II as being a commie, and as being a Nazi, and being a fascist, and being most everything. That's the way American people like to do, though. They like to put labels, one-word labels on
I was
people.
accused in the First World War of being a Bolshevik and an IWW and a pro-German and Lord only knows what. But
well, do you think the people have changed any today?
Not very much.
They are still subject to that same sort of swing.
That anybody who tells you or tells anybody that the American people are different from the people of the rest of the world, we're carried away by propaganda. Now, the truth about it is, in 1938, I think it was, I was speaking in Lewistown, Montana, and I said they're talking about war in Washington. I want to tell you people that if there's war, I'm going to vote against it. The whole audience stood up and applauded me. I said, you applaud me now. But when the bands begin to play and the flags burn and the propaganda gets out, I wonder if you'll applaud me then.
Well,
I saw that thing change overnight, and because I wanted to keep out of war, then again I was accused of being anti-Semitic, and I was accused of being pro-German and pro-Hitler, and the Lord only knows what.
Well, now let's back up to 1920. That's when you ran for governor.
Yes. You see, in 1918, they went to Senator Walsh and told Walsh that he was coming up for election, and that unless he got rid of me, that he would be defeated. And they sent his partner, Colonel Nolan and Hugh Wells, down to Washington and told him that. He first told them they wouldn't listen to it. But finally they had a lot of telegrams go into him and tell him they had to get rid of me, and he said to me, Bert, I'm afraid that they might beat me. And I said, well, if you feel that way, I'll resign. The Attorney General sent for me and said, you don't need to resign. But I said, no, I'm going to resign. And
then after that, did you go back to private practice?
I went back to private practice. But I said to myself, the Nonpartisan League was just getting organized in this state. And I was pretty sore and pretty mad because of the fact that I felt the company was back of demanding my defeat, because I had to prosecute Dan Kelly, one of their lawyers, for subornation of perjury, and some of their other people. And they wanted to get rid of me. So I was pretty mad about it, so I came back here. I didn't know any of the Nonpartisan League people at that time, but I got in touch with them and told them that I would help them. And I went out over the state and I spoke to audiences of 10, 15, and 20, whatever I could. And I took up how the politics in Montana was controlled, and said that there was no difference between the Democrats and the Republican Party, because both of them were controlled by the same organization.
That made you set right.
Yeah.
Well,
So then when the Nonpartisan League was meeting in convention, they sent for me and wanted to know if I would run on the Republican ticket in 1920, and I said no. Then they called up and said, will you run on an independent ticket? And I said no. They called up again and said, will you run on a Democratic ticket? And I said yeah. So I went out and I ran against McDowell for the nomination. McDowell personally was a good friend of mine, but I beat him badly, and I was nominated. Then after I was nominated, I was down at Dillon today, and when I was down there, I said to somebody, this is a town where they run me out of town. They wouldn't let me speak here after when I was seeking the nomination. And, but many places in the state, they wouldn't let me speak in the town because of the fact that they said the Nonpartisan League was so radical and
this was 1920.
This was 1920. And I ran against Joe Dixon. And Dixon defeated me, and I was the worst defeated candidate that ever ran for governor in Montana.
Well, Senator, 1920 may have been the worst defeat that anybody ever had in Montana, but 1922 started 24 years in the United States Senate for you. What kind of an election was that? A tough one?
Well, yes, it was a tough election, but I wasn't sure that I was going to be elected until I'd carried about halfway around the state, and then I began to feel that it was going to get. It's a long story, but the man who campaigned with me was Judge Jackson, and I kept telling him that I didn't think we had a chance because I knew if they didn't think I had a chance, they wouldn't spend the money. The opposition wouldn't spend the money.
And you figured he was reporting back home?
I knew he was reporting back home all the time.
Well, that's one way to become elected, is to let the opposition think that
that's right.
You're losing.
They defeated me so badly in 1920 that they didn't think, but conditions had changed in the meantime because you had a depression in Montana in about 1921 that hit Montana. And
well, now, Senator, in 1922 after election,
yeah.
You went back to Washington, and almost immediately you went on a trip over to Europe.
Well, I got back to Washington, and I was pretty naive and pretty green. And I went back to a La Follette meeting back there. And when I got back there, I thought Congress was going to convene on the 4th of March, but I found that it wasn't going to convene until fall. So I wired Mrs. Wheeler and asked her if she wanted to go to Europe. I felt that I had covered Montana, that I knew every nook and corner of Montana, probably better than any politician in the state. And I felt that I owed it to the people of Montana to know something about Europe when I take my seat. So she wired back, she did, would want to go, and she met me in New York.
Well, later on, as time permitted, you also went down to Central America, and you went over to Asia, did you not?
I went down to Central America, but I do want to get in one thing. I left, Mrs. Wheeler met me in New York, and I registered at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel, and we got in there in the morning, and we went and bought, it was tied up in the stores until the stores were closed. That was when we sailed for Europe in March 1917. Later when
No, not 17.
March 17, 1923.
23.
Later on, when I started the investigation of Doherty had a witness come out and had me indicted, and he had a witness come out and say that he met me for the first time at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel on the 16th day of March, and that I offered to split $1 million with him. Well, it just so happened that Mrs. Wheeler was with me from the time she got to New York until 11 or 12 o'clock at night. So there wasn't a word, but this fellow testified out in Montana that he offered to split $1 million.
Well, speaking of the Doherty trial, that was the Teapot Dome oil scandal that was on at that time, was it not?
Senator Walsh was conducting the Teapot Dome scandal. Senator La Follette had first introduced the resolution to, and then Senator Walsh was on the committee. Senator La Follette asked me if I wouldn't ask Walsh to handle the investigation, which I did, and Walsh agreed to do it and carried it on. During that same period, I introduced a resolution to investigate the Department of Justice because of the corruption in the Department of Justice.
I see.
And the two investigations were carried on at the same time.
And Doherty at that time was the head of the Department of Justice.
He was the head of the Department of Justice.
I see. And that ended with trouble for you, but at the same time, a great service to the United States.
Sure. Well, as a result of that investigation, Tom Miller was sent to the penitentiary, who was the head of the alien property custodian, and a lot of other people were sent to the penitentiary. It's a long story.
Yeah. Well, now we'll skip the Doherty investigation then. At this time, we may have time to get back to it, but in your travels around, if I remember correctly, later on, after you had been in Central America, you suggested before the Senate that we take the Marines out of Nicaragua, didn't you?
That was before I went there. As a matter of fact, I had thought that the people of South America, they were in Nicaragua, that they were progressives and reactionaries the same as we looked upon them in the United States. And I urged them to take the Marines out of Nicaragua. That was during Coolidge's administration. And I made several speeches on it. They finally held an election down there under the auspices of the Marines, and they elected the so-called liberal group. After that, I had decided I wanted to go down there and see what it was like. And I got down to Nicaragua. I went down to Panama and then flew up to Nicaragua. Mm-hmm. They met me and gave me a big celebration and so forth, and I had a B.R. Albin and Ray Hart of Billings with me. And it's another quite a long story, mm-hmm. but it's very interesting because I found out that, as a matter of fact, the only difference between, they were not the progressives and reactionaries like there were in the United States. It was just one group who wanted to get in and take over.
Take over power.
Take over power.
Well,
and after they got into power, they were pretty near as corrupt as the other group.
6 years went by, and in 28, you were running on a ticket at the same time that Al Smith was running for president.
Well, before you get to that, in 1924, I ran with La Follette.
Oh, yes, for vice president.
Vice president. And when I ran for vice president, La Follette asked me to run for vice president and said either he or I'd be elected. I turned him down and said no, I wouldn't run. He came out to my house on a Sunday afternoon, and I said no. But then there was a report around the Democratic Convention in New York where Al Smith was a candidate against McAdoo, and I was asked if I would run for vice president with John W. Davis, and I said no. They circulated a report round there that Doherty was going to have me indicted again in Washington. So I came down to Washington, and I got a hold of Ray Baker, who was a prominent man, Democrat, and asked him to check it out. He came back and said if I wouldn't run with the Follette, they would not indict me. And I said, is that so? And he said, yes. So I called up La Follette after he left and said, I've changed my mind and I'm going to run with you.
In other words...
I said, I'm not going to let him blackmail me the rest of my life, and I went and accepted and told him I'd run, and I ran for vice president. La Follette thought he thought either he or I would be elected president, but I never did. I told him we'd be lucky to get 5 million votes, and that's about what we got.
Well, shortly after that,
yeah, and
Smith was defeated and you were reelected,
yeah.
You came into a Depression era.
No, wait a minute. Smith was defeated John W. Davis was defeated for re-election.
Well, that was 24.
That was 24.
I'm back up to 28.
Yeah, well, in 1928, Al Smith was nominated then, and I was up for election for United States Senate. And that time Joe Dixon ran against me. Mm-hmm. He'd beat me for governor, but I defeated him for election, notwithstanding that Smith lost the state by something around 40,000 votes, as I recall it.
Well, after that election, we come up to 1930, the Depression years, and at about that time, weren't you for the remonetization of silver?
I came out for the remonetization of silver because I felt at that time during the Depression that there wasn't enough gold in the world to meet the needs of the world, and consequently I wasn't for it. And I came within one vote passing it through the United States Senate.
I wonder what difference that would have made today if we had had the remonetization of silver.
If we'd have had the remonetization of silver, you wouldn't have had just a paper currency, practically what you have today. I was in all the bankers in New York were opposed to it, of course. And on one occasion, Roberts of the National City Bank was at a meeting where I was, and he said, what you're trying to do is destroy the credited class. I finally said to him, what do you want? Do you want paper or you want silver? He said, you put it to me that way, and I'd rather have silver. He said, I'm not afraid of silver.
Well, as we got into the Depression, there was a change in political thinking in the country,
Yeah.
and if I remember correctly, in 1931, didn't you start in supporting Roosevelt
That's right.
for the presidency?
That's right.
In
And
fact, you were the first man to go out and raise some money, if I remember correctly.
I was the first senator that came out publicly for Roosevelt.
And who did you get that first money from?
Well, Frank Walker, who was friendly with Kennedy, came to see me and asked me if I knew where I could get some money for Roosevelt. I said to him, Joe Kennedy asked me in 1932 in New York, Joe Kennedy, I knew him very well, and he asked me who I was for president. I said, Roosevelt. He said, let me ask you a question. Who is Roscoe for him? And I said, no. Well, he said, if that so-and-so isn't for him, I'll be for him. So when Frank came to me, I said, you might get some from Kennedy, and I got a hold of Kennedy's man, and he put up $5,000 for him. Then he gave him $37,000 and loaned him $50,000.
And later on, Kennedy became ambassador to England.
He came ambassador to England. He wanted
head of the SEC too.
He was for the SEC, and he was head of the SEC, and he was head of the one other commission. But he wanted to be Treasurer of the United States. And when Roosevelt wouldn't give it to him, he wanted to become Secretary of Treasury. Oh. Roosevelt wouldn't give it to him, and he became very bitter and called him everything he could think of.
Well, Senator, after getting the $5,000 from Joe Kennedy, father of President Kennedy, I suppose, and then Roosevelt was elected, I suppose that you sort of felt like you were in clover. You'd been in the Senate with all Republican presidents, hadn't you?
That's right.
Let's see, Harding and Coolidge and Hoover.
Yes.
And so with a Democratic president in there and a Democratic Senate, because that's what you had.
Yeah.
In 32, wasn't it?
That's right.
Why, you were sort of in clover.
Well, I had, as I said, been the first senator that came out publicly for him and supported him and all over the country. And he was very, very friendly to me. I worked for him at the convention, and I got Joe Kennedy to support him. I got other people to support him, and he was extremely friendly.
Well, we were in a depression then.
In fact, some people call me teacher's pet.
Well, we were in a depression then. Did that help you get anything from Montana? Did that help you do things for Montana?
Oh, yes, I think so, but he felt very friendly to me, but...
well, you handled considerable legislation, but you didn't support Roosevelt, if I remember correctly, all 100% of the time.
Oh, no.
In all of the things that he wanted.
He, as a matter of fact, he disagreed with me on the remonetization of silver, as I said.
Well, you had started on the remonetization of silver, though, with Coolidge, hadn't you?
During Coolidge's administration. But then, when I came within one vote of passing it through the Senate, then Jack Garner told the president that if they didn't do something about the monetary situation and do it right away, that then that I would pass the bill the next time it came up. So then he called in a group and left me out of it. And that's when he arranged the new financial bill, the gold bill, the so-called gold bill, and these other legislation. Well, I was pretty mad about it, and Frank Walker called me up one day over the phone. He said, I understand you were on the warpath last night, and I said, that's right. And he said, well, you can't afford to break with Roosevelt, and I said, I can afford to break with him any time I want to. And I got back to the office, and Roosevelt sent for me. Well, it's quite a long story, but I finally offered an amendment giving him the power to remonetize silver. But he started in on the purchase of silver as a result of that. Then, when it came to the Fort Peck Dam, a group of people came to see me from Omaha and wanted me to talk to Roosevelt about it. I said, will it give some irrigation in eastern Montana? Will it give some cheap power there? And I said it will give some water so those dryland farmers can take a bath at what they'd gone through the Depression. They said yes. I went up to see Roosevelt. I talked with him for 15 minutes, and he agreed to give me Fort Peck Dam.
In other words, that was sort of a sop on the silver.
The truth about it was he wanted to be nice to me because of the fact that we'd had a run-in over that.
Well, now, speaking of dams, the Fort Peck Dam wasn't the only dam that you had anything to do with here in Montana. What about the Hungry Horse Dam?
The Hungry Horse Dam, they never could have got it through the Senate. I went over, as a matter of fact, in the House and helped talk with Mike Mansfield about getting it through the House. Came over to the Senate. When it came to the Senate, the head of the Appropriations Committee, Carl Hayden, in the Senate, said, "But I can't get this through." And I said to him, "Well, who's against it?" And he said, "Bridges and Brooks." He said, "Bridges comes in with all of the Republican votes in his hand," and he said he and some of the Southerners will not vote for it. So I said, "I'll see him." And I went and saw Brooks, and he said, "See Bridges." I told him, and Bridges said, "Well, give me the minimum of what you got to have." So I gave him the minimum. I told him I'd have to have this and have to that. He said, "Well, I'll do it for you, Bert, but I won't do it for your colleague."
So that got it started.
And that got it started.
What about the dam up at Polson? As I remember, that was the first one that there was ever any arrangement made. That's on an Indian reservation. That's the first time that the Indians were ever paid for a dam site, isn't it?
That was the first time that anybody ever paid a royalty for a dam site. Now, on that, I said, this belongs to the Indians. The white settlers up there were for it. The Montana Power Company wanted it. But I said, this belongs to the Indians, and you've got to pay a royalty for it. Senator Walsh first didn't agree with me, but I told him what my views was and so forth, and then when it came up, he agreed with me. And when the first meeting was, he sat down and said, this belongs to the Indians, and so we made the Montana Power Company pay a royalty, and that's the first time in the United States that anybody ever paid a royalty. Now, since that time, they've made them do it.
I see. Well,
but while they made the private power company pay a royalty to the Indians for it, they didn't want to pay the Crow Indians anything for taking that dam.
Well,
power site.
Times change.
Times change.
Well, on the water power and irrigation, what about irrigation projects here in Montana? We used to have a lot of area that didn't have any irrigation.
Oh, I got so many irrigation projects in eastern Montana that I can't remember them all, but I remember that...
Well, now, would you say that the election of Roosevelt in 32, and you being a Democrat, he being a Democrat, and a Democratic Congress, that helped?
Yeah, as a matter of fact.
Or was it the Depression?
No.
The fact that the country was down and that we got into a different line of thinking.
Well, there were two things. Of course, one thing was the Depression. The second thing was that the Congress gave him the power to spend money as he wanted to spend it. And secondly, he built these dams. He built a dam for Dill over in Washington. Then he went
the Cooley Dam.
Then he went to build a dam for the Republican Charlie McNary.
McNary began with M. That's right.
And he used this money to spend for projects with people that he wanted to be friendly with and to help.
And to influence.
Now, when I disagreed with him on the court issue, and I licked him on the court issue, if I do say it, he got very mad at me over that.
Well, I remember because I was in your office the morning that the settlement came.
That's right.
It was a very interesting little piece of maneuvering you did that morning. But let's not get into the court thing now, Senator. Let's talk about irrigation.
Yeah. Well, I was going to say, over in Miles City, they wanted an irrigation over in that district, and I got that for them. And I got other irrigation projects. Some of them I've forgotten so long ago now that I've forgotten about it.
Well, I have had the privilege of riding around over the state with you several times and seen people that have come up to you and said, this is the man. I remember one man over in eastern Montana on a Sunday it was. This particular day you were using me as sort of a dog tester. Yeah. I got out of the car to see if the dog would bite. He was barking. And
I was afraid of dogs.
And when they found out that Senator Wheeler was out in the car, why, the man was all dressed up in a nice vest, and he said, Mother, come out. This is the man who saved our house, our home. And it was a farmer over in eastern Montana, but you had numerous of those experiences. In fact, I saw a man just the other day who said that you got him a job, and he is now retired. Now, on all of those kind of things, it must have given you a great deal of satisfaction to be able to help folks in Montana.
One thing what I was able to do, because I was chairman of the Interstate Commerce Committee, the farmers of eastern Montana needed boxcars for their wheat. They weren't be able to get them because of the fact that the boxcars were being used in the east. But because of my position as chairman, I got a hold of the Interstate Commerce Commission and said, you got to get boxcars out to Montana for those farmers. Then I called up the Great Northern Railroad and the Northern Pacific Railroad and said, you got to get boxcars. And they got them out there. Now, when Senator Ecton came in, and they asked him after I was defeated, and it said to me, and they said, well, Bert Wheeler got us these, and he said, well, I'm not Bert Wheeler. Well, he was not in the position.
Yeah.
But everybody in the Senate knew that, as a matter of fact...
Well, of course, you had put through some railroad legislation of great importance, too.
Exactly.
That makes a difference.
That makes a difference. But in addition to that, I mean, the senators from North Dakota and from South Dakota, I remember one of them made a speech, and he said that all the money was going to Montana for irrigation projects and so forth, and they were not giving anything to... But Roosevelt, as a matter of fact, did more for me, notwithstanding the fact that I disagree with him. Now, a lot of people said he couldn't get anything from Montana because Roosevelt hated me and I disagreed with him. A group of people came down from Great Falls, the mayor of Great Falls and the head of the American Legion and the head of the Secretary of Chamber of Commerce. They went around for 10 days, and they saw Senator Murray, and they saw the congressman. They got no place. They finally came to see me, and they wanted the
Air Force base?
Airport base. I said, would you like to see General Arnold? They said, the head of the Air Force. They said, can we see him? And I said, I think so. I called him up, and I said to him, General, this is the Secretary of Chamber of Commerce, this is the head of the American Legion, this is so forth. I said, they think the Army won't do anything for me because of the fact that I disagree with Roosevelt on the war issue. He said, that's silly. He pressed a button. He called in 3 generals, told them to look into that. And in a very short time, we had that air base. Now, that's been the greatest thing for Great Falls that's ever happened to them.
Well, made it the #1 city population-wise in the state.
That's right.
Well, in addition to saving homes and farms during the Depression years, you also had something to do about lowering interest rates, didn't you, for farmers through the land bank?
During the Depression, I got the land bank to reduce the interest rates for the farmers. I introduced legislation. And
now, was this before or after you had broken with Roosevelt on the NRA? That was the first thing you broke with him on,
that's
wasn't
right.
it?
I broke with him on the NRA. Well, the first thing I disagreed with him on silver. Then I broke with him on the NRA. I didn't break with him. I just simply said that I was against it. And Con Kelly of the Anaconda Company came to see me to ask me to vote for it. And I said, Kelly, you want to get away from the Sherman Antitrust Act. He said, that's right. He said, we go into the room, we lock the doors, we agree upon the price of copper, but he said, after we get through, he said, somebody goes out and cuts the price of copper, and we don't. I said, you better leave well enough alone. I said, Kelly, this is going to pass, and I'm going to vote against it. You're going to come down here in less than a year's time and tell me it won't work. He came down in less than 3 months' time and said, I'm going to hire John W. Davis. I said, what is that? He said, well, I didn't know it was going to work this way. I said, Kelly, if you would have asked some of us people that know what score is down here, I said, you'd be a lot better off, and so forth. He afterwards came out to Montana and said he'd learned to have a lot of respect for my judgment.
Well, now, was this before or after the Utility Holding Act?
That was before that. Let's see. I'm not quite sure. I think,
well, at any rate,
I think it was after that.
The Utility
I'm
Holding
not sure.
Company bill came along, and,
Yeah.
and you had a lot to do with that, too.
I handled that, and Roosevelt, as a matter of fact, Roosevelt wasn't particularly friendly to me at the time, and they were going to ask Rayburn to introduce it. And they called me, and they called Norris, and they called a group of us up there, and as we left, I said that I had a bill, and Roosevelt said, well, Rayburn will introduce it. So anyway, they hadn't any more than got down to the office, so Tommy Corn came down to see me and wanted me to handle it. They said, now, this will be passed in the House. You won't have to do anything until it gets in the Senate. We have to get over in the House and get bogged down, and then they came to see me. And I finally put it through the Senate with one vote. With just one vote.
Well, then you had the court fight when you did break with Roosevelt.
Well, after I put it through the Senate, however, and then it got into conference and was tied up in conference, Roosevelt said he didn't think I could get it. I had to take it back to the Senate, and I said I won't take it back. I said this bill is either going to pass or it's going to die in conference.
Well, if it went through with one vote, you'd have had trouble with it back in the Senate.
I would have lost it. I'd have lost it.
Yeah.
But I insisted, and I finally got it through, and he was very much pleased.
Well, then he blew cool again in the court fight.
Yes, then he got mad at me in the court fight.
But the court wasn't packed.
The court, we licked him in the court.
That's right.
Then after that.
Then you had railroad legislation.
Then we had railroad legislation.
That you handled for him.
Yes, he sent for me. He'd get mad at me. I can show you the correspondence I had. When he was friendly, he'd write me a letter and say, my dear Bert, or dear Bert. And then he would sign it, yours sincerely, FDR. When he was mad at me, he'd say, my dear Senator, yours truly, Franklin D. Roosevelt.
Well, when it came to World War II and you tried to keep out of the war, it was my dear Senator again.
Yeah, my dear Senator.
But nevertheless, in 1940, you were asked to run as vice president.
That's right.
And probably because of the fact that you had made such a good case to keep out of the war.
Yeah, even though I disagreed with him, and in the convention, right up to the last minute, I disagreed. But Tommy Cochran, Ben Corn, Leon Henderson, Foley of the Treasury Department, all of them pleaded with Mrs. Wheeler and I for me to take the vice presidency. And they, at that time, were the closest people to Roosevelt.
Right.
And I said no, that I couldn't do it because he's going to get you in the war.
Well, again,
but after that,
in 44, you were...
Right up to the last minute, they pleaded with me at the convention. And then in 1944, when they didn't want Wallace, and they sent, Frank Walker came to see me, Sammy Rosenman came to see me, Secretary of Navy came to see me, and not Knox,
Forrestal, was it by that time?
Forrestal. And came to see me again and talked to me about running for vice president. But it wasn't because he loved me so much. It was because of the fact that he thought I had a certain following in the country.
Well, in 1946, we came to the year when you were defeated.
Yes.
The people in Montana defeated you in the primary.
That's right.
And ever since then, you've been a most successful lawyer, and financially, they really did you a favor.
Very definitely. The money came into Montana from New York and Hollywood.
It was an out-of-state campaign.
Definitely.
Definitely. Well, today, Senator Wheeler, who has been kind enough to go through with this interview tonight and this afternoon, sits here at 81 and a half years of age. He still hikes and fishes in Glacier Park and makes Montana his home whenever he can. Now, Senator, just one final question. Some people say that you've changed your ideas since you first went to the Senate. What about that?
Well, I think that that's true. I went to the Senate as a young man without any experience. I was the second youngest man in the Senate, and I thought I had all the answers. I was in favor of government ownership of railroads, and I thought I had all the answers to the world problems and everything else. But after I got to the Senate and was there and saw what was going on the waste and the extravagance and the corruption during the Harding administration, and it was appalling. And it just makes you wonder sometimes how this government can last when you see what's going on and know the truth of the things that's going on in Washington.
Well, I hate to bring this to a close, but this is the book that the Senator has written, Yankee from the West. Burton K. Wheeler with Paul Healy. It's a book that you'll enjoy. It's a book you ought to get if you haven't already read it, and read it. You'll find it in the bookstores, and you'll find it in your public library and in your school library. So get up to date on Montana politics with Senator Burton K. Wheeler, Yankee from the West. Thank you.
Thank you.
This has been another in our series of interesting people in Montana programs prepared by the Greater Montana Foundation.